Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Keble debate, why poetry really matters. I'm delighted to be joined by my good friend, Professor Christine Gerrard of LMH, and also Director of Torch, the Oxford Centre for the Humanities. Sadly, our close friend and my closest cancer buddy, Emeritus Professor Vincent Gillespie, is not well enough to be able to join us this evening, but has sent me and discussed with me a number of contributions that I'll share with you through this evening. So I think we'd like to sort of dedicate the debate to Vincent. Structure-wise, I will read a few poems for discussion with a couple of inimitable inputs from Stephen Ferguson. Christine will then share her thoughts on these and other poems, and we'll have a bit of a discussion. And finally, there will be time for some other poems, if requested, and some questions. Poetry, just pure poetry. Words on a page or aloud. It's a tradition going back to Greek, Roman and Viking days. No actors to watch as a play unfolds, no structure and safety of plot and character like a novel, just words on a page. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. And here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedarn cover, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as air beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in thick fast pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momentarily was forced amid whose swift half intermittent burst huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail. Amid these dancing rocks at once and ever it flung up momentarily the sacred river. 5 miles meandering with amazing motion through wood and dale the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns measureless to man and sank in tumult to a lifeless sea. Amid this tumult, Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain and the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Aborar. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such deep delight would win me, that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair. Weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread. For he on honeydew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise. Okay, so obviously Kubla Khan. Vincent was particularly keen that we read Kubla Khan as it reflects on Coleridge's compositional method, using his notebooks and his written account of his own dreams that he often turned into his finest poetry. Vincent mentioned also the concept of energia, the Horatian idea as if it unfolds before your very eyes. Over to Stephen Ferguson now for Auden and Yeats.
I'm going to move over to the light, both in the sense of Robin and the landman.
Come and stand behind me.
Thank you.
Yeah, that'd be perfect. I'll move over for you.
Thank you. In memory of W.B. Yeats, W.H. Auden. Section 2. You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all. The parish of rich women. Physical decay. Yourself. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Nor Ireland has her mad south. From ranches of isolation and the busy griefs, raw times that we believe and die in. It survives the way of happening a moth. And then, if I may, the start of Easter 1916 by W.B. Yeats, of course. I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces, from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head, or polite, meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite, meaningless words, and thought before I had done of a mocking tale, or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where mockery is worn. All changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.
Thank you very much. Companion piece to that, my more modern play, Easter 2020. Words for you in your time of silence, words bent, twisted, warped across the weft of an ignorant media. Will you finally re-emerge for us now, splattered with desert sand and so otherworldly? Long hair, robes, and piercing blue eyes. Will you speak again with singular authority, those incisive, timeless words heard only in the throes of war, famine, pestilence, and plague? Words so light that even the gentlest breeze could carry them far, far out to distant oceans. Words before Auschwitz, Belsen, and Nagasaki, after Cannae, Masada, and Thermopylae, before Rome falls and Constantinople burns, after the Somme and then Stalingrad. Will anyone hear these precious words before this silent, faceless, brutal killer chokes the last of us, hidden in lonely fastness, leaving only shadows to fill the prairies? Okay, now, poetry can be dangerous to its writer in terms of owning up to it and possibly getting punished for it. William Blake, his diverse and symbolically rich work, embraced the imagination as the body of God or human existence itself. A theist who preferred his own Marcionite style of theology, he was hostile to the Church of England and almost all forms of organised religion, a very dangerous belief in his time that could well have seen him exported or worse. So the songs of innocence and experience, and innocence first. When the greenwoods laugh with the voice of joy and the dimpling stream runs laughing by, when the air does laugh with our merry wit and the green hill laughs with the noise of it, when the meadows laugh with lively green and the grasshopper laughs in the merry scene, when Mary and Susan and Emily with their sweet round mouths sing ha ha he, when the painted birds laugh in the shade where our table
where cherries and nuts is spread. Come live and be merry and join with us to sing the sweet chorus of ha ha he. And then the counterpart from in terms of experience, possibly the scariest poem I've ever read about London. London. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles of I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry every blackened church appalls, and the hatless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues a marriage hearse. So a very, very sharp contrast there. Now, one of Christine and my favourite poets. We'll do Gerrard Shelley next. Not one of our favourite poets. Ozymandias. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trackless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half shrunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, king of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. The lone and level sands stretch far away. Couldn't do this. Can't just sing like leaving the Windhover. The Windhover to Christ our Lord. I caught this morning's minion kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dapple drawn falcon, in his riding of the rolling level underneath him, steady air, and striding high there, how he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wind. In his ecstasy, then off forth on swing, as a skate's head sweeps smooth on a bow bend, the hurl and gliding rebuff the big wind, my heart in hiding stirred for a bird, the achieve of the mastery of the thing. Brute beauty and valour and act, O air, pride, plume, here buckle, and the fire that breaks from thee then 1,000,000,000 times told lovelier, more dangerous. O my chevalier, no wonder of its sheer plod makes plough down Scythians shine and blue-beaked embers, my dear, fall, gall themselves and gash gold vermilion. And lastly, I'm going to just 2 short poems of G.M. Hopkins, Bedo classicist, Jesuit priest, not published in his lifetime, probably for fear of being thrown out of his very strict order, Catholic order, and his monk effectively. His praise of God through vivid use of imagery and nature, very high risk for his time. Anybody who has access to Campion Hall could actually read some of the original manuscripts that he wrote by hand. I'm not senior enough, but I'm sure others are. So just two last poems from Sir Geoffrey Hill, the Keble man, an Oxford professor of poetry. In two poems, he bravely confronts the Holocaust, avoided by all other poets from 1945 up till him, and explains his fear. Ovid in the Third Reich. I love my work and children. God is distant, difficult. Things happen too near the ancient troughs of blood. Innocence is no earthly weapon. I've learned one thing, not to look down so much upon the damned. They in their sphere harmonise strangely with the divine love. I in mine celebrate the love choir. And in a very complex and self-denying way, the famous one, September Song, born 1932, which this is Geoffrey going to Auschwitz and sees a girl born on the same day he was, who was born 1932, and she was deported 24/9/42. Undesirable you may have been, untouchable you were not. Not forgotten or passed over at the proper time. As estimated, you died. Things marched sufficient to that end. Just so much Zyklon and leather, patented terror. So many routine cries. I made an elegy for myself, it is true. September fattens on vines, roses flake from the wall. The smoke of harmless fires drifts to my eyes. This is plenty, this is more than enough. Christine, your thoughts, directions and considerations, quite a variety of that.
So, thank you, Robin. So you've read a very wide range of poems, and I think in response to the type of prompt of this talk, why poetry really, really matters, I'd probably like to take it back to a more democratic and inclusive sense of why poetry matters to everybody. I think that the poem that you read by Blake, Songs of Innocence and Experience, particularly the one, Songs of Innocence, it's like a nursery rhyme, and a lot of Songs of Innocence are modelled on childhood poems. I'm thinking from memory, the sun does arise and make happy the skies, the merry bells ring to welcome the spring, and so on. They're childlike poems, and I think the point that I'd like to make at the beginning really is that poetry is in all of us. That's why it matters, basically. Poetry, to use a phrase in Yeats's Lake Isle of Innisfree, he says, I feel it, I hear it, not feel it, I hear it in the deep heart's core. The rhythms and the rhymes of poetry, and I think that Gerrard Manley Hopkins is a really excellent example of that, are all features of ourselves, basically. It's our heartbeat, it's the beat that we live to. And it is no wonder, really, that as small children, we love nursery rhymes. Ding dong bell, pussy's in the well. Black bar, black sheep, have you any wool? Yes, sir, 3 bags full. Georgie, Poogie, pudding and pie, kiss the girls and make them cry. These are things that we remember. I'm very interested in memory and why people memorise poems and how people absorb and internalise the rhythms and rhymes of poetry, and what they take away with them and what poetry means to them. One of the most remarkable students that I ever interviewed for a place at English at LMH was a profoundly deaf young man who'd never heard in his life. I mean, he couldn't hear. And he recited for me Alden's poem, The Night Train, perfectly, because he could hear the rhythm of the train in the sound of the beats of the poem. So I feel that I'm on a mission, basically, to get people to love poetry and not to feel that it's something that they need special tools to appreciate. I think often people at school, when they do GCSE English, they get put off poetry because they feel that they need to know the name of assonance, alliteration, the different types of feet and iambic pentameter. So what are these things? You don't need to know that to love poetry. And the poetry that I grew up with were things that I learnt. No, not even learnt. I just read. I mean, I think things like Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott. On either side the river lie long fields of barley and of rye that clothe the wold and meet the sky. And through the field the road runs by to many towered Camelot. And up and down the people go, gazing where the lilies blow, round the island there below, the island of Shalott. So you're drawn into the poem, and I think this sort of vivid, picturesque world, things like another poem, Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, with the sea snakes, blue glossy green and velvet black, they coiled and swam, and every flash was a track of golden fire. These are things that are vivid and memorable. So I think that poetry is in us, and we are exposed to it early. I'm on a big project now with English Heritage called Poetry, Heritage and Community, which is getting young people to read poetry and connect it with sites in English Heritage. And they have something called the Poetry Takeaway, which is a kind of burger van that travels around the country. And people come and write poems, and people are encouraged to get connected to poetry, both written poetry and poetry that they themselves make. So that's kind of some of my response to this. I think that I find it interesting that a lot of the poems that you've read touch upon creativity. I mean, the body began with, it's such a great poem, mysterious and dreamlike. This is endowed de Kubla Khan, a stately pleasure dome decree. But it's actually a kind of story, really, about energy and poetic creativity. In thick, fast pants was breathing, flung up momentary, a sacred river. I mean, this is actually the allegory of Coleridge himself writing this poem. I think, and the self-portrait of the poet at the end, and his flashing eyes, his floating hair, for he of honeydew has drunk the milk of paradise. It's that kind of, sort of creativity. And I think it's about coming back to the very early stages. I talked about children and poetry, and one thinks about poetic communities. Before you go down by talking about words on the page, of course, there weren't words on the page from the earliest poetry. I mean, Homer's poetry is oral. Anglo-Saxon poetry or English poetry, that too depends upon not just rhyme, but it depends upon that alliterative beat. Woden the werewolf for water and the moon and Viking where it is west over Panton, over Sheerwater, Schuller's Waven, that's from the Battle of Morden. And those rhythms are what Gerrard Manning Hopkins in that sprung rhythm is actually, echoing, because he loved that stuff himself too. So I think that reading poetry and reciting it out loud is really important. I think there's also a way in which poetry goes with us into places that are difficult. And I've written some articles about women poetry, actually in Ireland, weirdly enough, in the 18th century. I mean, like Letitia Pilkington. I don't know why I'm talking about this now, but Letitia Pilkington was a poet, and she had a remarkable memory, basically. And she learned huge screeds of poetry off by heart because she had no access to the books. She lived a very peripatetic life. She was always being thrown out of her lodgings, and led a quite sad life in the end as a sort of scandal memoirist, because nobody took her seriously as a poet. But you could see that when she writes, she quotes poetry, and the poetry is part of who she is, and it comforts her in moments of trouble and difficulty. And I feel that that's often true of poetry, particularly as you move into the Romantic period. So I myself, I mean, my area of specialism is really the 18th century. I'm currently editing the Oxford Book of 18th Century Poetry, or the Oxford Handbook to 18th Century Poetry. a series of essays on 18th century verse. But I think it's actually in writers like Wordsworth and Coleridge, basically, where feeling, I mean, poetry is it that Wordsworth said in the Lyrical Ballads, that poetry is the spontaneous expression of powerful feeling. And whether it's spontaneous or not is dubious, but there is something about emotion and poetry's ability to connect us with emotion that makes for great poetry, I think. I think Wordsworth is I know we haven't read any Wordsworth, we've read Coleridge, but I think that many of Wordsworth's poems, which as an undergraduate I thought were pompous, actually to me as a much older person now speak a kind of sincere truth to them. I'm thinking about poems like Tintern Abbey and some of the other poems in Lyrical Ballads where he'll have a phrase like thoughts that do often lie. One of my favourite poems from the 17th century is George Herbert's poem Prayer 1, which you may know, which is a series of analogies for what prayer or that connection with God is. I won't read it all, but it goes through a series of parallels, and then he says, heaven in ordinary, man well dressed, the Milky Way, the bird of paradise, church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, the land of spices, something understood. And the something is that which is inexpressible. And I think that Wordsworth also captures that, where he sees a woman standing with a pitcher on her head in the Lake District, carrying water home, and the weather is very bad, and he sees her, he said, I'm just quoting from memory, he says that her garments vexed and tossed by the strong wind. And in that moment, he sees in this woman an almost classical symbol of the human capacity to endure in really difficult conditions. And he says, trying to recall the scene, he said, I should need words and colours unknown to man to paint the visionary dreariness. And that's a really interesting phrase because it's kind of synesthetic. And I think that poetry often points to that sort of fusion of the senses, of sound, of sight. One of my favourite poems is Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard, which was a fantastically popular poem. So I think it's 1751. And I've often wondered why that is, basically. And I think, I don't know how many people here know that poem, but I used to teach on a summer school for American students, and I had a student called Louis, it's a great name, who from Virginia, who later went on to become a neurosurgeon, as I discovered. And he, I found, could recite Gray's Elegy off by heart. Apparently his father had actually bribed him with $20 to accomplish this feat. But there's still something about those poems as well, about the sort of the time of nature or in the twilight where sight fades and sound takes over. So I'll try to quote how that starts. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Now fades the glimmering landscape on the sight, and all the world a solemn stillness holds. So there's that sort of liminal space. And I'd like finally to come back to thinking about Gerard Manley Hopkins. And so I knew Robin when I was an undergraduate, and he probably won't recall me sort of marching around the centre of Oxford reciting bits of Gerard Manley Hopkins, because I had a bit of a passion for it. But now to me, Hopkins seems all the more kind of prescient than he was then. I think partly it was very interesting. As a Torch director, I yesterday had a whole series on climate hope and climate despair. So I was doing a little seminar with people from outside. It was really interesting, giving sort of causes for hope and despair around climate change. So I had a whole mass of scientists and other people coming in to talk about this. And then I think back to Hopkins and how much of his poetry is about how man ruins the natural world, basically, but how nature refreshes itself endlessly. So I think the poem that you read, The Winterhover, is actually a glorious poem because it captures the wildness and the beauty of nature. One of my favourites it is called God's Grandeur, where he says, the whole world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. So that's how it opens. But there's a passage in it where he talks about man spoiling nature. Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel, being shod. And then that's the climate despair. And then at the end he says, and for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. So that's wonderful compression of that line. And I feel that even poetry written from previous generations actually speaks to us today around the things that we are concerned with within our world. And that's why poetry really, really matters. Thank you.
No, that's brilliant. I completely agree, but isn't it extraordinary how some of these words come in from a sort of attempted religious understanding of the world, and others come in from a very personal attempt to understand the world in words that are absolutely in no way religious. And it fascinates me, I suppose, we didn't, between us, manage to read Yeats's poem, The Second Coming, but that is a poem, and maybe we'll read it later and get Stephen to perform again, but that's Yeats sort of reaching out. But there is this extraordinary sense that Vincent talked about of trying to recognise the unrecognisable, trying to put into words experience into words, and coming right up against the edge of experience, and that extraordinary sort of reaching out. I think that's fascinating, and obviously for people like somebody like Blake, he was very low profile, very little published in his lifetime, sort of hidden away, and his remarkable wife was also a remarkable engraver and drawer. But it's a combination of he's one of those rare people where you get the combination of the artwork and the poetry, sort of reaching out towards something that is at the edge of his experience. It's, I think it's very, very powerful. I mean, Yeats not my favourite poem, but I think The Second Coming I think The Second Coming is a good poem, isn't it, Christine?
Yes, I'm not an expert on Yeats actually, so I probably wouldn't really be able to tell you whether I think it's not a poem that I know or have taught very much actually. As you can see, I feel more comfortable. Well, actually, American poetry and modern American poetry I like a lot, but
I very nearly read Dorothy Parker's very short verse.
Actually, one thing I did want to say, right, and I haven't said it, is actually poetry's ability. I mean, I've come across. I mean, I know I've been speaking about poetry that's about feeling and emotion, and probably I don't know why I'm in a deep vein of seriousness tonight, but there is poetry that makes us laugh, and also thinking about its political remit. Can be savage and biting,
and bring home truths in ways that other forms of political writing can't. So my first books that I've written, and I mean, I was saying earlier on that I write about Swift. I also write about Alexander Pope a lot. They all wrote in rhyming couplets, or John Dryden. And in that period of time, before the Romantic period, I think poetry really was less a vehicle for self-expression, basically, than it was a vehicle for social commentary and political commentary. And there are some brilliantly savage uses of couplets to really hammer home a point. So even in a poem like Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock, which is funny because it's a sort of social or witty social satire about a sort of social mishap in which somebody cuts off the lock of somebody else's hair, and this causes a kind of enormous controversy. But there's slipped into it a sort of couplets where you know they're in Hampton Court and they look out of the window, and there's just as an aside the couplet which goes, the hungry judges soon the sentence sign, and wretches hang that jurymen may dine. The hungry judges soon the sentence sign, and wretches hang that jurymen may dine. And I think that captures the kind of expeditious nature in which, you know, the judges are sitting there, you know, their stomachs rumbling, and they just sign somebody's death warrant, basically, because lunch is ready, basically. And there's the kind of satirical humour that comes out of those poems, which is often risque and yeah, I just think like the opening of Dryden's Absalom and Achitophel, which is a kind of satirical poem about Charles II's promiscuity, and under the allegory that Charles is King David, the poem opens, in pious times, ere priestcraft did begin, before polygamy was made a sin, when man on many multiplied his kind, ere 1 to 1 was cursedly confined, then Israel's monarch, that's Charles, then Israel's monarch, after heaven's own heart, his vigorous warmth did variously impart to wives and slaves, and wide as his command scattered his maker's image through the land. So the idea that, I can't remember, I think it was Clarendon who said that that king should be the father of his people, and Charles was certainly father to a good many of them. So poetry can also be, you know, it's got that kind of capacity to make us laugh and to make political points. You know, poetry can do so much. It can also be nonsense, and I think one of the sort of delights of children, I keep reverting back to children and poetry, but I was thinking before I came out about Lewis Carroll, actually, and of course this is Oxford, so this is very appropriate. But, you know, you think of a poem or some of the ones in Alice in Wonderland, like "'Twas brillig, and the slithy tove did gar and gimble in the wabe, all mimsy with the borogroves and the moanrath outgrabe." What does that mean even? But it's kind of funny because it sounds great. I mean, you've got that sort of wonderful playfulness with sound, which I do think is such a part of language. And in a way, that's what's so great about you reading poetry, because poetry is meant to be read out loud. I would love it in schools if more people went in for the kind of thing that, I mean, there are some schools that do it, where you have poetry contests and people learn a poem and they recite it in front of other people. And I don't think we do enough of that, because poetry isn't always meant to be read in a little private space. It's often meant to be recited out loud and shared, you know, as it was originally. So, yeah.
It's interesting because I close my eyes and I go back and I'm a 9-year-old boy in a brutal school where, you know, flogging happened after tea most days for most people. And there's one wonderful English master who, instead of us having to do daft exercises outside in cold January, says, right, we're going inside, we're all going to sit down. And then he God bless him, Chris Arthur, then he bellows Kubla Khan at us. And I've never forgotten it. And I close my eyes and talk through the line, recite the lines of Kubla Khan. I'm back there as a hungry small 9-year-old listening to these wonderful words echoing round the room. And it sort of leaches back into my brain, and it's wonderful. And
there's a kind of comfort in it too, I think. And this is where learning poetry is so important, because, as you can see, I do remember poetry, and it brings me comfort in times of difficulty. And the phrase will float into your mind, actually, like your memory of being at school in a hard situation. And I think poetry is really powerful like that, in ways that the prose is rarely, because of its sounds. It's the aural properties of poetry that roots it in ourselves. You know, I think that's true.
It's very special. Do you want to read the Second Coming?
No, I don't want to read the Second Coming.
Okay, fine. Okay.
I'm avoiding Yeats. I can do the Lake Isle of Innisfree off by heart, but I will let you do this.
Okay. It seems a shame not to use the wonderful voice of Stephen Ferguson.
Yes, right. We need an Irishman.
If you come over here, it's that fellow there down to there.
I can just read this print and no more with glasses in London. The Second Coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dim tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out, when a vast image of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast? Its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born.
Wonderful. I mean, gosh, that's a tough dream, isn't it? You're sort of going through two layers towards a nightmare. Very effective. Christina, are we allowed the Lake Isle of Innisfree?
Sorry?
Are we allowed the Lake Isle of Innisfree?
Well, a very different sort of Yeats, I think. I'll just have to try and dredge it up, as it were, very appropriate. So, I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, to a small cabin built there. Now, I will arise now and go to Innisfree, to a small cabin built there, of shale and wattle made. 9 bean rows will I have there, hive for the honeybee and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I will have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping on the blades of the morning to where the cricket sings, there midnights all a glimmer, and noons a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wing. I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping like low sounds on the shore, standing in the roadway or on the pavement grey. I hear it in the deep heart's core. Close enough.
Excellent.
And that actually, where's the power of that? That's the place, isn't it, that we have in our mind, and that Yeats must have had. It's similar to Tintern Abbey, or you know, when Wordsworth is in London and he imagines himself in the Lake District. It's that special place that we recall again. You know, the comfort, the Lake Isle of Innisfree. Probably when you're, you know, standing in the roadway or in the pavement grey, I hear it in the deep heart's core. The place that stays with you, the nature. It's the simplicity of nature. Yeah, it's interesting actually. Yeah,
It is, isn't it? Very powerful. Has anybody got a poem, sort of on the shorter side, that they want to that resonates with them and they want to share? Bill, have you got anything up your sleeve?
The warden has one, but I was very impressed when I first met him. I thought, this new warden, when I first met him 18 months ago, and all he can ever do is synthesise Ebola viruses, and I thought, what's the point of that? But I did ask him about how important humanities is to the future of the world, and he quoted T.S. Eliot, didn't
you? I did, but it's a small quote rather than a.
You may know it, but The Rock.
From The Rock.
And he quoted, so what is it? What wisdom have we lost in knowledge? What knowledge have we lost in information? Which I probably, and he then went on. We talked about Google, and we got your information is cheap, isn't it? How cheap information is today. But what wisdom have we lost in that? What knowledge have we lost in that? And that would be, since he quoted that and has used it, I thought that might be an appropriate thing to discuss. Do you know The Rock at all? The poem?
No.
1930, so he wrote it in 1930. I looked it up since then. He wrote it in 1934. He's worried about, which is again relevant possibly, the decline of the Church of England and the loss of churches. And what he was worried about was all these newfangled things like radio and newspapers and so on, distracting people, taking them away from what was relevant. And we hear it all still today about, Donald Trump and all that kind of thing, and fake news and so forth. He wrote it about that, and I subsequently discovered it was based on the Book of Job, chapter 13. It was equally used the same line.
Difficult book.
Anyway, there is something I would connects me, the warden, and Keble College, hopefully. But T.S. Eliot, The Rock. What knowledge have we lost? What wisdom have we lost in knowledge? What knowledge have we lost in information?
Oh, that's very good.
Quite profound, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank
you.
We'll dug out that now. Any questions? Most probably for Christine rather than me, but I'm happy to answer questions with Christine. Anybody got any? Yep.
Do you find there are some poems that you think are particularly resonant in the human soul and in your character? Because I always find that poems that are particularly easy to memorise ones that use a lot of internal rhyme and strong meters. I mean, meters. I'm thinking of Ballad of Reading Gaol and The Raven and
The Raven. Yeah.
Lawrence Dunbar.
Yeah.
A lot of those I find are particularly easy to memorise and therefore really resonate with me. Do you find?
Absolutely. I think you're right about that. It's really interesting. I think The Raven is a fascinating piece of writing. So I can't quote this from memory, but there's a wonderful. I don't know if anybody knows The Raven. but you're right that it's a poem that has much internal rhyme. In fact, it's a poem that's driven by not just by it's like a couplet where you've got the end stopped rhymes or a couplet rhymes, but where it builds accretively through internal rhyme schemes. Once upon a midnight dreary, as I wandered weak and weary, as I pondered weak and weary o'er many a fable of forgotten lore, as I wandered nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping as of someone gently rapping on my chamber door, and that's how it goes on. And you know, you can remember it because it you know, it's all internal rhyme as well as end rhyme. There's a wonderful, I don't know if you've ever seen this, The Simpsons did a fantastic version of that poem with the guy who died recently, who played the voice, who did the voice of Darth Vader, that actor, I've forgotten his name, but he is actually the person reading the poem, and if you ever get the chance to watch it, it's very scary actually. I mean, it's funny, but scary at the same time, like the poem. But I think you're right, that rhyme, it really helps, and I think that blank verse is harder because it doesn't have those devices in it, and so it isn't as locked in memory. Although passages of blank verse do lodge basically, but not whole poems. And I think the whole just to say that my elder son, who is actually just to say he's actually a nanochemist. So this is, you can do poetry and science, a nanochemist from Houston, but he won the school poetry contest reciting the Raven off by heart, and it is a hell of a feat of the memory, but quite a thing basically. He was in the same year at school as Florence Pugh, the actress who you may know. In fact, they both were into this stuff together, which was quite interesting. But yeah, sorry, in answer to your question, I mean, yeah, absolutely. And I think, in fact, the ones that have the most rhyme are actually the kind of the easiest to remember. Yeah.
There's an extraordinary stanza from Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem, The Haunted Oak, which is an elegy from the perspective of a tree on which a man is lynched, and there's extraordinary, it's going to run there, it just sticks you so easily, hang on. And nevermore shall leaves grow forth from the bough that bears the ban. I am burned with dread, I am dried in death from the curse of a guiltless man. It's
brilliant.
Extraordinary, and
it's a mixture of things, isn't it? It's rhyme, but it's also alliteration. Yes. You know, I mean, and Hopkins actually is a great alliterative poet. I mean, and you could tell from the Windhover, you know, as a skate's heels sweep smooth on a bow bend. It's such a fantastic line, actually. You know, it kind of rings out. Yeah, I mean, and there's nothing like that in prose. So, you know, just say
poetry wins. Okay.
Poetry wins. You know, that's it. Yeah.
Any other sort of? Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. It's a bit of a two-pronged question. One, I'm wondering if memorizing poems helps you to understand them a little bit better, and then also if you've ever had experiences where you're recalling a poem maybe 10 years down the line and you realize something new about the poem you hadn't really thought of before.
That's both of those are really interesting questions. And in a way, they're quite linked, aren't they? Because it's something about whether you understand something better if you're very familiar with it, and or does it just become something that's a sort of background? Whereas if you saw it on a piece of paper, and of course I do both because I have to, you know, so I sit there and think, oh, it works because you've got that metaphor in it, and of course that connects with this, you know, it's the old business of teaching poetry or any literature really. But then what you find out later on, in answer to the second part, I think that what happens is that you change and then the poem stays the same, but the poem suddenly means something to you that it didn't when you were younger. So I think Wordsworth would be a very good example for me. I'm not sure that I thought when I was young, 18, 19, I thought that Wordsworth was devoid of humour. I thought he was humourless, I thought he was heavy, and I didn't kind of get it. And then when I'd been through a lot more of life and had known what it was to experience loss and to witness suffering, I really did understand it, and then it meant more to me basically than it had ever done before. And now for me, my 18-year-old self would be horrified, my 19-year-old self, in saying that for me Wordsworth is the kind of the quintessential poet of the human heart, really. And I wouldn't have said that. I wouldn't have known what that meant at 19, actually. Whereas now I do, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's part of the sort of the journey of poetry, isn't it? And perhaps we'll all come round in the end to Edward Lear, because it makes us smile. Any other thoughts, observations?
I do have a comment. I'm coming from a different regional context from the Arabian Peninsula, but everything you said seemed to resonate a lot, even when it comes to memory. There is a Saudi anthropologist who's saying that when the Arabian Peninsula was predominantly illiterate, they kind of had their collective memory written in a rhyming poetry for it to be remembered easily. And I can see many incidences where people from my fieldwork, told me about how poetry was central to life, to the point that in the early 20th century there was pearl divers were had like a catastrophe where there was a storm and a lot of people died, and one of the people who lived through the crisis kind of gone mad, and their way of curing him was to actually recite poetry about this catastrophe, thinking that reciting of poetry about this catastrophic event actually can have some sort of way for them to gain their senses back. But this idea of memory, I think it's really interesting, because the elders in my family say that they lost their memory of poetry. But when they hear the first line of one poem, they would continue, from memory, reading 16 or 20 lines of memory. So even when people claim that they forgot something, after they developed Alzheimer, suddenly started reciting many poems that we never heard. So I think this is where, no matter how regional context, poetry seemed to resonate in so many ways, I think.
I think that's really interesting. There are several strands to that, and I think the point that you made at the beginning is really valuable as well. Because obviously I've been talking here about individual memory, but actually cultural memory and historical memory is a collective and communal act as well, and I think that is really, really important, and must have been so actually in ancient times too. When people were not literate, actually, so they would remember the same things.
So is it not true, if you could tell us, that one of the reasons for the spread of Islam and the Quran was that if you can speak Arabic, I understand it's incredibly beautiful, it's incredibly poetic, which is one of the reasons behind the spread of Islam as quickly as it did in a society that didn't read but could recite.
But people also used to be able to recite the Bible as well, which is quite interesting.
Absolutely.
We've lost that. But I also like the idea too, which you come to at the end, where you talk about poetry as a kind of a way of healing from trauma in some ways. It's a sort of therapeutic quality, and I haven't talked a lot about this, but there is quite a lot of work on that too, basically, which I think is really, really interesting. There's quite a lot of medical humanities work around, poetry as the poetry pharmacy, basically. Yeah, which is interesting.
I too, if I may, find that very moving about poetry healing.
Yeah.
And in the press this week, Fergal Keane, the great Irish war correspondent, who's had trauma upon trauma upon trauma in front of him all his life, had a breakdown recently, in fact many breakdowns. And he said that one doctor recommended he read poetry from morning to night, and this other doctor recommended he go jogging every morning. and he much preferred the poetry advice.
It's very interesting, and you can follow that through. That I think the man who I would describe as the cleverest person I've ever met, and I don't use those words lightly in Oxford, is the most extraordinary man. He got the top English first in his year. Vincent got the number 2 one. Got the All Souls, one of the two All Souls fellowships to 7 years. And he was very interested in poetry and memory and how they overlapped. And he thought, well, I need to look at this from another angle. So he went off, 28, 29, down to London, qualified as a doctor, so a whole load more training. And then he went off to America, including at many of the best medical schools, studying. And then he came back and got a second fellowship at All Souls in medicine. And the best starting point for him, Ian McGilchrist, is the messenger and his emissary. And that really does, because he studied poetry, he studied the mind memory, and that is the most extraordinary book. And gosh, I'd love to get him down from the Isle of Skye where he's retired, but that is an extraordinary book and worth a read. The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist, Professor Dr. Ian McGilchrist, most extraordinary man, and that's definitely would figure in with both the questions that you've asked there. Most extraordinary. Jenny, how are we doing on the time front?
We're another 5 minutes.
Another 5 minutes? Sure. No, because perfect. I want everybody who's come this evening to have the opportunity.
Question on the far right.
Perfect.
It's a sort of a question, and I just want to put this out there. I volunteer with a group of people that have had strokes and they've lost their language, and I had the feeling that poetry could help us. We make things up as we go along. We're sort of attached to the Stroke Association, but we're all volunteers and we're just feeling our way. Over the past 2 years, we have introduced poetry sessions, and with mixed results. Everyone's had a go. There are about 20, 30 people that come. And there's one guy who he is very shy, a retiring person, and obviously he's lost his ability to speak fluently as well. Since doing the poetry, he has found not necessarily his speaking voice, but his communication voice, and has been writing poetry of a spectacularly high. I mean, he's a really clever guy. He was a mathematician at Oxford, sort of typical North Oxford person you get to your group. But, it just is amazing how it's been poetry that has unlocked, especially for him, but for other people as well. But there's nothing happening in Britain. There's nothing happening to link aphasia and poetry, which I find astonishing. So if anyone out there is interested in that, linking poetry and aphasia, that would be great to speak to you.
On a similar note, there's a remarkable Irish poet, Frank Ormsby, and he's written a series of poems recently about how he's coping with Parkinson's disease himself. And they're so informative, both as to how he should be treated and how he's suffering, that it's been made basically compulsory reading in quite a few specialist courses for nurses and doctors treating Parkinson's. It's extraordinary. There was a Radio 4 the other day.
That's really interesting. One of the blood cancer groups that I belong to has special Zoom meetings for men who typically find it much more difficult to talk about emotional issues than the ladies, and poetry is I've got to sort of produce something for the next one, and poetry is what I'm going to try and use to, I don't know, to perhaps as a foretaste to try and make it easier for people to talk about their own emotions. But I completely agree with you. I think it's very valuable, and I think there are quite a number of medical situations and conditions where it'd be enormously helpful.
Yes, it's just I was just thinking about that. My father had a stroke, actually. It's interesting. I think that there's more of it, actually, at the younger end, basically, than there is... what I mean is that I think, so places like the English-speaking Union, for example, work with people who have, or they go out to schools, basically, and do quite a lot of work on with poetry and just generally public speaking and teaching people to speak. And I think that there's work around people who have speech and language, children who have speech and language issues, which actually has become, unfortunately, more prevalent in the period since COVID. And I think that the sort of the ability to own a text and to speak it basically does help people get over some of those barriers. My younger son actually had massive speech and language issues, basically, when he was younger, and I think he went to a special school which actually helped him with that quite a lot. Because actually you're performing rather than kind of being yourself somehow. So it's like a kind of, learning how to articulate is really, really helpful. But I think that more work, what you say is really interesting, actually. And I'm sure that there is more work to be done in that area, which would be interesting.
Definitely. No, I completely agree with that, and I'll let you know how these elderly men cope with, because somehow talking out somebody else behind the cover of somebody else's emotion, poetry, can free you up to maybe say something about yourself, or even when you're talking about that other person, what you're actually doing is expressing your own emotions. And sometimes men find that difficult. That's definitely excellent. Well, it remains for me to thank you all very much for coming, and to a huge round of applause for Professor Christine Gerrard coming to keep us on the straight and narrow.
Fantastic.
Christine, many thanks.